Imagine you're having one of the most important conversations of your life. Maybe you're asking for a raise, trying to convince a difficult coworker, or trying to fix a relationship that's slowly falling apart. You came prepared. You have facts. You have logic. You have the perfect argument, but the more you talk, the more the other person shuts down. Eventually, the conversation goes nowhere. Most people think they failed because they didn't make a strong enough argument, but that's usually not the problem. The real problem is how the other person feels while they're listening to you. And few people understood this better than former FBI hostage negotiator. Welcome to Unspoken Wisdom. Chris Voss spent more than 20 years negotiating for the FBI. His job wasn't to win arguments. His job wasn't to prove people wrong. His job was to keep conversations alive. Because the moment someone feels attacked, they stop listening. And once people stop listening, there is no negotiation. After years of working in high-pressure situations, Voss realized something surprisingly simple. People don't change their minds because you have better logic. They change when they feel understood. In 2016, he published these lessons in his best-selling book, Never Split the Difference. Today, it's considered one of the most influential books on negotiation, not just for business, but for everyday life. Its central idea is remarkably simple. Before people are willing to understand you, they want to feel understood first. Chris Voss calls this tactical empathy. At first, it sounds complicated, but the idea is actually very simple. Empathy doesn't mean agreeing with someone. It doesn't mean giving up your opinion, and it certainly doesn't mean letting someone take advantage of you. It simply means understanding how another person sees the situation before asking them to see yours. That sounds obvious, but in real life, most of us do the exact opposite. Imagine your coworker says, "I'm tired of always getting blamed. I've been doing everything I can." Most people immediately respond with something like, "Yeah, but you were late yesterday," or "Don't take it so personally." Sounds reasonable. But both responses miss the most important thing, the emotion. Now watch how tactical empathy changes the conversation. Instead of defending yourself, you simply say, "It sounds like this has been really frustrating for you." Then, you stop talking. Just wait. A few seconds later, they might say, "Yeah, it feels like no matter what I do, it's never enough." Notice what just happened. You didn't offer advice. You didn't argue. You didn't try to change their mind. Yet somehow, the conversation became more open. Why? Because before people want solutions, they want to know their feelings have been acknowledged. That's the real purpose of tactical empathy. Not to win the conversation, but to lower the other person's defenses, so the real conversation can finally begin. And once that happens, Chris Voss uses several simple techniques to keep the conversation moving. The first one might surprise you. The first technique is surprisingly simple. It's called mirroring. At first glance, it almost feels too simple to work. All you do is repeat the last 2 or 3 words the other person just said. Then, you stay quiet. For example, imagine your coworker says, "I feel like the workload just isn't being shared fairly." Instead of immediately offering your opinion, you simply ask, "Isn't being shared fairly?" That's it. No advice, no disagreement, no explanation, just those few words. Then, silence. At first, it feels awkward. Most of us are uncomfortable with silence. We rush to fill it, we explain, we justify ourselves, we try to solve the problem. But Chris Voss discovered something different. When people feel they're truly being heard, they naturally keep talking. A few seconds later, your coworker might say, "It's not even about the amount of work. It's that nobody notices who's actually doing it." Now you've learned something important. The real issue wasn't the workload, it was recognition. And you didn't discover that by asking better questions. You discovered it by giving them space to continue. Mirroring works because it sends a simple message. I'm listening, not I'm waiting for my turn to speak. Just keep going. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as encouraging elaboration. When people don't feel interrupted or judged, they're more likely to organize their own thoughts. and reveal information they weren't planning to share. Sometimes, they even discover what they're really feeling as they're speaking. That's why silence isn't empty. Silence creates space, and in negotiation, space is valuable. Chris Voss often says that silence is uncomfortable, but discomfort isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes, it's exactly what encourages the other person to keep talking. But listening alone isn't enough. People don't just want someone to hear their words. They want someone to understand what those words actually mean. And that's where the next technique comes in: labeling. The second technique is called labeling. If mirroring helps people keep talking, labeling helps people feel understood. Most of us make the same mistake. The moment someone tells us about a problem, we immediately look for a solution. We interrupt, we give advice, or we explain why they shouldn't feel that way. But Chris Voss suggests doing something very different. Instead of solving the emotion, acknowledge it. For example, imagine your friend says, "I've been working so hard," and nobody seems to notice. Most people would respond, "Don't worry, just keep doing your best." It sounds supportive, but it skips over the emotion they're actually experiencing. Instead, try saying, "It sounds like this has been really frustrating for you." Then, stop talking. Your friend might take a deep breath and say, "Yeah, I just feel like nothing I do is ever enough." Notice the difference. You didn't solve the problem. You didn't tell them what to do. You simply recognized what they were feeling. And somehow, they became more open. Why does that happen? Psychology offers an interesting explanation. Researchers call it affect labeling. Several neuroscience studies suggest that when people put feelings into words, activity in the amygdala, the part of the brain heavily involved in emotional responses, tends to decrease. At the same time, areas of the prefrontal cortex involved in emotional regulation become more active. In simple terms, naming an emotion can make it easier to manage, not because the problem disappeared, but because the brain no longer has to fight an unnamed feeling. That's why a simple sentence like, "It sounds like you're really frustrated," can be far more powerful than, "Here's what you should do." There's another detail that makes labeling even more effective. Chris Voss rarely says, "I think," or "I feel." Instead, he usually begins with phrases like, "It seems like," "It sounds like," or "It looks like." Why? Because these phrases don't force your interpretation onto the other person. They invite them to correct you. And surprisingly, people often appreciate that. Sometimes they'll say, "Actually, it's not frustration, it's disappointment." Perfect. Because now they're telling you exactly how they feel. And every time they clarify, you understand them a little better. That's the hidden purpose of labeling. It isn't about proving that you understand someone. It's about giving them the opportunity to feel understood. But even after someone feels understood, one challenge still remains. How do you move the conversation forward without making the other person feel pressured? Ironically, the answer begins with one word: no. The third technique may sound completely backward. Most people believe the goal of a negotiation is to get the other person to say yes. Chris Voss disagrees. In fact, he believes one of the most powerful words in any conversation is no. At first, that sounds like failure. But think about it. When someone feels pressured to say yes, they often become defensive. They look for a way out, or they agree without actually agreeing. But no is different. No gives people a sense of control. It tells their brain, "I'm still making my own decision." And strangely enough, the moment people feel they're in control, they're often more willing to keep talking. Imagine asking your manager, "Can we talk about my salary?" It immediately creates pressure. Now, compare it with this. Would this be a bad time to talk about my compensation? The second question gives the other person permission to say no. And that's exactly why it often feels safer to answer. The conversation starts naturally, instead of feeling like a confrontation. Finally, Chris Voss says there's one phrase that's even more valuable than, yes, that's right. Why? Because yes can mean many things. Yes, I understand. Yes, I'll think about it. Or simply, yes, so this conversation can finally end. But that's right means something completely different. It means, you understand me. And that's the moment trust begins. Imagine your coworker has been explaining a frustrating situation for several minutes. Instead of offering advice, you simply summarize what you've heard. So if I'm understanding you correctly, this isn't really about the workload. It's about feeling like your effort goes unnoticed. If you've understood them correctly, they'll often respond with something like, exactly, that's right. That moment matters, because people rarely become open-minded until they first feel understood. Most of us will never negotiate for the FBI, but every single day, we negotiate with our families, with our partners, with our co-workers, with our friends, and sometimes even with ourselves. The biggest lesson Chris Voss learned wasn't about negotiation. It was about human nature. People don't resist because they're difficult. They resist because they don't feel heard. And maybe that's the real reason so many conversations fail. We spend so much time trying to be understood that we forget to understand first. Because in the end, the best negotiators aren't the people with the strongest arguments. They're the people who make others feel safe enough to have an honest conversation. And that is a skill anyone can learn. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to Unspoken Wisdom, where every story is grounded in real evidence and every lesson is meant to help you understand the human mind a little better. See you in the next video.